All right, so today we're going deep on something that's been talked about for a long time. Circumcision.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a ton of research and historical accounts, even some interesting trivia, too.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just about what happens in the procedure, though.
Yeah.
We're going to really unpack all the cultural stuff.
Right.
The religion, the roots, and even all the debate around it today.
Exactly.
Get ready for a ride through time and tradition and some pretty deep questions.
Yeah, the thing about circumcision, I think, is it seems pretty simple on the surface.
Yeah.
But there's so much complexity when you really get into it. It's a procedure that has just crossed so many boundaries.
Okay.
Religion, medicine, cultural identity, social norms across, thousands of years.
Really, it's like we're following this thread through history.
Yeah.
And it kind of changes color depending on when and where we're looking at it.
Exactly. And that journey starts way back.
Okay.
In ancient Egypt, something like 2400 BCE. We're talking stone carvings and hieroglyphics that actually show this happening as part of their society.
So we're not just theorizing. There's actual proof of this going back that far.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And the evidence suggests it wasn't, just some everyday thing.
Yeah.
It seems like it was tied to rituals, maybe even rites of passage for boys going into adulthood.
Okay.
There's links to purification, ideas about cleanliness.
So really, right from the beginning, it's more than just a physical thing. It's really tied into their society.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
And that idea of ritual and meaning, you see that carry over into other ancient cultures.
Okay.
Take the Abrahamic covenant around 2000 BCE. Circumcision becomes a central pillar in Jewish identity.
It's not just a tradition, it's a covenant with God, right?
Exactly.
It's a physical sign of that relationship. And it's really amazing that it's still practiced almost the same way today, thousands of years later.
Right, you've got it.
Yeah.
The Brit Milah on the 8th day after birth,
Right.
still a cornerstone of their faith and their practice.
It's incredible how something can last for centuries
Yeah.
and still mean so much. But I'm guessing the view of circumcision hasn't always been so things change.
You're right. As cultures interacted and their values changed, so did how people saw circumcision. The Hellenistic period between the 4th and 1st centuries BCE is a great example.
Okay.
Greek culture at the time, they were all about celebrating the natural form.
Okay.
That really clashed with the idea of circumcision.
So a society that valued physical perfection saw circumcision as changing that ideal.
Exactly. They thought it was a type of mutilation.
Oh, wow.
Going against how the body should naturally be. And this clash really had an impact.
Okay.
Some Jewish people during this time actually tried to reverse their circumcision.
All right.
To fit in with Greek society.
It makes you think about all the pressure people feel to fit in to different cultures. It wasn't just about the way it looked. It was about belonging.
Yeah, for sure.
Wow.
Circumcision really became the symbol of where you came from.
Right. And what people did with that really shows the dynamics of that time.
Yeah.
And this leads us to another turning point.
Okay.
The rise of Christianity. How did early Christianity, which came from Jewish tradition, deal with this practice?
Yeah.
Did they see it the same way?
That's where we see a really big shift in thinking.
Okay.
The Apostle Paul's teachings led early Christians to move away from circumcision being necessary.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because the focus became faith, not physical ritual.
That's right.
Okay.
That theological shift changed things.
Yeah.
It separated Christianity from Judaism on this.
Okay.
And it really affected how common circumcision was in places where Christianity took over.
It's really interesting how such a specific practice could cause such a big difference between these religions.
Yeah.
Shaping their futures. So circumcision was super important to Judaism,
Right.
but not seen as needed for Christians. But it didn't just go away completely, though.
No, not at all. The story of circumcision doesn't end there. In the 7th century, for example, it became really common in Islamic communities.
And was this based on the Quran?
Interestingly, no.
Okay.
It's not actually required by the Quran, but it's considered a sunnah.
Okay.
Something modeled after the Prophet Muhammad.
So it's a tradition based on following what the Prophet did.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's often linked to cleanliness and cultural tradition,
Right.
usually done in childhood or adolescence.
Yeah.
It becomes part of Islamic life,
Okay.
although not with the same level of religious requirement as in Judaism.
So now we've got 3 major religions.
Right.
Each with a totally different relationship with circumcision. And it seems like the reasons behind it just keep expanding. Religion, tradition, social pressure. So When does it become a medical thing?
Yeah.
When does that shift happen?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
We have to jump ahead to the 19th century,
Okay.
to Victorian Britain and the U.S. That's where we see that change start.
What happened then that caused such a change?
Well, the 19th century was a time of huge change, both socially and scientifically.
Right.
There was this new belief that science could solve just about anything.
Yeah.
Including stuff about health and morality.
So circumcision gets swept up in all that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
At first, it was promoted as a cure for things.
Yeah.
Like, and this might sound strange, excessive masturbation.
Wow. Didn't see that coming. That wouldn't fly today.
No, not at all. But back then, it was a reflection of what people were worried about at the time.
Yeah.
Then, as germ theory became more popular, circumcision was seen as a way to be cleaner and to lower the risk of infections.
So the reasons for doing it change again.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just religion or culture anymore. It's about being healthy and clean.
Yeah.
It's crazy how the justification seems to change with the times.
It really shows how what's happening in society shapes how we view our bodies and the medicine we use. And this shift, especially in the U.S., really impacted how common circumcision became.
Oh, okay.
It became more and more common in medical settings.
Yeah.
And by the middle of the 20th century, it was basically routine in lots of parts of the country.
It sounds like a real turning point.
Yeah.
Circumcision going from this ancient ritual to a standard medical procedure.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a feeling the story doesn't end there. Right?
Oh, you're absolutely right. You're totally right. There's more to the story. It's important to remember that even though it's common in the West, circumcision isn't done the same way everywhere.
Right.
It's part of all these different traditions and beliefs that change depending on the culture.
That's a really good point. We've been talking about it from the Western perspective, but let's look at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Can you give us some examples of how it's done and what it means in other parts of the world?
Sure. Let's go to Africa.
Okay.
Circumcision is often really tied to rites of passage there.
Right.
The Xhosa people of South Africa, they're a good example.
I've heard a bit about their coming-of-age ceremonies.
Mm-hmm.
They do circumcision, right?
Yes, exactly.
Love it.
For the Xhosa, it's a huge step in a young man's journey to becoming an adult.
Okay.
It shows he's ready to take on those responsibilities. It symbolizes strength and bravery.
It's not just physical. It's like a transformation, a public way of saying you're an adult in the community.
Exactly. And these ceremonies are full of tradition, reinforcing those values of courage and belonging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so different from the medical side we've been talking about.
Right.
It shows how the same procedure can mean totally different things in different cultures.
Yeah.
Are there other cultures where circumcision is linked to those coming-of-age traditions?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay.
If we head over to Southeast Asia,
Okay.
to Muslim-majority countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, circumcision is done for both religious and cultural reasons.
So kind of like the Xhosa rituals, it's a transition to manhood that's celebrated by everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These ceremonies, like the Brit Milah in Judaism, are often really happy occasions, full of symbolism and tradition.
Right.
They mark this big change in life and they celebrate it together.
It's fascinating that even with different religions and places, that idea of transformation and community recognition is in so many of these practices.
It really shows how humans create rituals and
Yeah.
how powerful they are in shaping who we are, both as individuals and as groups.
Okay, so we've looked at the ancient roots, the religious side, the shift to medical in the West, and all the different ways it's practiced culturally. But even today, it's still a big topic of debate.
Yeah.
What are some of the main things that keep this discussion going?
Well, you're right. Something with such a long and complicated history is bound to bring up strong opinions and ethical questions.
Yeah.
One of the biggest issues is consent.
Right, when it's done to infants, they obviously can't agree to it. That brings up questions about having control over your own body and whether it's right to make that choice for someone who can't say what they want.
Exactly. This lack of consent is at the heart of a lot of the debate.
Yeah.
It makes us think about how far parents' authority goes.
Right.
And if it's okay to make such a big decision for someone else, especially a baby.
It's a tough one, for sure. And I imagine it gets even trickier when you consider the medical arguments for and against it.
Absolutely. There's research suggesting circumcision could have some health benefits.
Yeah, I've heard about those.
Yeah.
What are some of the potential benefits that researchers have found?
Studies have shown that it might lower the risk of urinary tract infections in babies.
Okay.
There's also evidence it could reduce the risk of penile cancer later on.
Uh-huh.
And importantly, research suggests it might lower the risk of transmitting certain sexually transmitted infections, including HIV,
Right.
especially for straight men. In fact, these potential benefits have led organizations like the WHO to recommend circumcision as a public health strategy,
Right, yeah.
particularly in areas where HIV rates are high.
So from a public health perspective, there's an argument for it, especially in places where those risks are higher. But I'm sure there are people who disagree with that.
Oh, for sure. There are definitely other viewpoints.
Okay.
Critics say the benefits are often exaggerated and that they don't outweigh the ethical problems.
Okay.
They point out that complications, while uncommon, can happen.
Right.
And they emphasize that focusing on circumcision might mean we miss other, more effective prevention methods for these conditions.
So it's a complex issue with good points on both sides.
Right.
It seems like the medical stuff alone doesn't give us a clear answer.
Yeah.
What are some other worries that people who are against circumcision have?
Well, besides the consent issue, some critics bring up possible psychological impacts. They argue that taking away part of the body without consent could affect people emotionally later in life.
So it's not just about the physical act, but also the potential long-term psychological effects, especially when it's done without consent.
Right.
I guess those against routine infant circumcision would say we should wait until a person can make their own informed decision.
That's a core belief of what's called the in-tactivist movement.
Okay.
They think people should have the right to choose what happens to their own bodies,
Right.
including whether or not to have circumcision when they're old enough to understand the risks and benefits.
It's interesting how this connects to the growing focus on body autonomy and individual rights we see in many parts of the world. And I'd bet this debate is especially intense in the U.S., where circumcision has become so normal.
You're right. It's not just a theoretical discussion.
Right.
It's something really personal that's tied to cultural norms, family traditions, and individual beliefs. And this is very different from many European countries where circumcision is seen in another way.
How so?
Well,
What's different about the European view compared to the American one?
in a lot of European countries, circumcision is usually only seen as necessary if it's for religious reasons.
Okay.
They put more importance on keeping the body intact and a child's right to decide about their own body.
Okay.
This has even led to some attempts to limit or even ban circumcision,
Wow.
which has then sparked debates about religious freedom and the rights of parents.
Seems like we've gotten into some really complicated territory.
Yeah.
Circumcision is connected to questions of health, religion, culture, ethics, and individual rights. No wonder it's such a debated topic.
It really makes us think about some fundamental questions.
Yeah.
How do we make choices about our bodies?
Yeah.
What are the limits of what parents can decide?
Right.
And how do we balance individual rights with cultural and religious practices?
Right.
These aren't easy questions to answer.
Before we finish up, let's change gears a bit.
Okay.
Let's look at some of the more interesting, lesser-known parts of circumcision's history.
Okay.
You know, those moments that make you rethink what you thought you knew.
I was hoping you'd say that. Circumcision's history is full of surprises.
Yeah.
For example, did you know that in some ancient cultures, it was a sign of kingship?
Really?
Yeah.
A symbol of royalty.
Mm-hmm.
I always thought it was about hygiene and religious stuff back then.
Well, there's evidence suggesting that in ancient Egypt,
Okay.
pharaohs were often shown as being circumcised,
Uh-huh.
and this might have been connected to their divine status
Okay.
and their role as rulers.
Wow.
It was a visual representation of their power and sacred authority.
So from a symbol of power in ancient Egypt to a potential health measure in the modern world, circumcision has certainly had many different meanings.
It really has.
What other interesting historical facts have you come across?
Well, have you ever heard of the legend of the Holy Foreskin in medieval Europe?
The holy foreskin. Okay, I'm interested, but also a little skeptical. What's that all about?
It might sound unbelievable,
Yeah.
but a number of churches in medieval Europe claimed to have relics
Uh-huh.
that they said were the foreskin of Jesus Christ.
Seriously?
Yeah.
And people actually believe this?
They did.
Yeah.
These relics were worshipped, they became the focus of pilgrimages, and fueled religious excitement.
Wow.
Of course, there was a lot of debate and doubt about whether they were real,
Right.
but it's a fascinating example of how something like circumcision could get mixed up with belief and religious practice.
It's amazing to think about how strong beliefs can be and how far people will go to connect with their faith. It reminds me of how even today, people see and experience circumcision in their own way.
Speaking of changing interpretations, did you know that in Victorian England, circumcision was sometimes promoted just because of how it looked?
Really? So it wasn't just about health and hygiene during that time?
No, it seems not. Some people argued that it made you cleaner and more attractive.
Okay.
Which shows how focused they were on appearance and social rules back then.
It's incredible how the reasons for circumcision seem to have changed with the social and cultural concerns of each time period.
Yeah.
One last interesting thing before we wrap up. I recently learned about foreskin restoration. What's that all about?
It's something that's become more common recently.
Okay.
It really shows how complicated some people's feelings about circumcision are.
Right.
Basically, it involves stretching the skin that's left to try and make it look and work like the original foreskin.
So it's like trying to undo circumcision.
Yeah.
What would make someone want to do that?
It depends on the person.
Okay.
For some, it's about getting back something they feel was taken away without their consent. Others might want to get certain feelings back or improve how they see their body.
Right.
And for some, it's a way of dealing with their emotions and experiences related to circumcision.
It sounds like a very personal choice.
Yeah.
Often with a lot of emotion and complex psychological stuff involved.
Absolutely.
It shows that circumcision isn't just a physical change. It can have long-lasting effects on people mentally and emotionally.
Right.
And it reminds us that how we understand our bodies, our connection to them, and the choices we make about them are always changing.
Yeah, for sure.
Wow, we've really covered a lot in this deep dive into circumcision.
We have.
From ancient rituals to the medical debates happening today.
Yeah.
It seems like it touches on just about every part of the human experience.
It really does.
It's a way to look at how we see our bodies, how our understanding of health and ethics is changing, and how individual choice and cultural tradition bump up against each other.
Yeah, it is.
As we wrap up, what are some of the main things you hope people listening will take away from this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that circumcision is so much more than just a surgery. It's a practice that's woven into human history, spirituality, and cultural identity.
Yeah.
And how we see it both personally and as a society is constantly changing, shaped by new information, social norms, and ethical ideas.
It's a good reminder that even things that seem simple can be really complicated and nuanced.
Right.
And that it's so important to have respectful conversations when we're talking about sensitive topics with different points of view.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it says a lot about this practice that it still creates such strong discussion and debate.
Right.
These conversations, even though they can be tough sometimes, are really important for understanding each other.
Yeah.
And figuring out how to navigate these complex areas where personal beliefs, cultural practices, and medical stuff all come together.
Well said. So before we leave our listeners to think about all of this, I have one last question.
Okay.
How do you think all these debates about circumcision show how our views are changing about the body, individual choice, and traditions?
That's a great question to finish with. I think the circumcision debate is like a small version of bigger discussions that are happening all over the world.
Okay.
We're living in a time where there's more and more emphasis on things like personal freedom, informed consent,
Right.
and the right to make decisions about your own body.
Wow.
But at the same time, we're trying to figure out how to respect different cultures and religious practices, especially when those bump up against ideas about health and personal choice.
It's like we're reevaluating things.
Yeah.
Questioning the things we used to just accept and trying to find a balance
Right.
between what individuals want and keeping traditions alive.
That's a really smart observation.
Yeah.
And this process of reevaluating, even if it's uncomfortable at times, is a good thing in the end.
Okay.
It makes us talk more openly and honestly about tough issues,
Yeah.
which helps us understand each other better and find more thoughtful ways to handle these difficult situations.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into circumcision. We've traveled from ancient Egypt to modern-day hospitals and explored the history, the culture, and the ethical side of this ancient practice.
Yeah.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope everyone listening has a better understanding of this complex and often controversial topic.
I hope so too.
Maybe even learned a few surprising things along the way.
Right.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going.